I would like to welcome Pastor Carl Smith and Dr. Willie McLeod back to our podcast. And before we started, we were just talking about the weather. Apparently in South Africa, there's a lot of rain. On my side, we're heading into summer, so it's only -6, so it's absolutely wonderful. So today we will be looking at a couple of things. The sealed scroll, the seven seals, the trumpets, and the scales. And what we will be focusing on is just doing an overview and looking at the structure. So it should be quite interesting. I'm basically working off a structure that Willie did for us and in one of his books. And then hopefully that'll lay the foundation for us to dig a bit deeper as we move on. So yeah, so anything from you guys? Willie, Carl?
Yeah, thank you, Lebay. We will just have more like a general overview of the whole prophecy part of the books today, which is very interesting, I believe.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
So Willie,
so I'm looking forward to that, just focusing on a sort of overview of everything from chapter 6 to chapter 22. And sometimes, there's such a lot of interesting stuff in there. It can feel quite overwhelming. And if one has a sort of simplified structure to understand, how things progress in the book, I think it can be of great help. So the purpose is just to give a very simple overview of a basic structure of how the prophetic part is structured, and also some of the most important visions that forms part of this prophetic part of the book. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to share my screen, and we can sort of start. So Willie.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think what is interesting is that when one, we've talked about that the previous time, is in chapter 5 in Revelation, we saw that the sealed book was in the hands of the one seated on the heavenly throne, which clearly represents God the Father. And then we saw that Jesus Christ, the Lamb, represented as a lamb, as if slain, that he went and he took the scroll. And then we've seen that this sealed scroll clearly contains the prophecies, the prophetic part of the book. In the rest of the Bible, sometimes in the Old Testament, different prophecies, for example, in Daniel, is also referred to as being sealed. So to break the seals and reveal the prophecies, that's what we'll find from chapter 6 to the end of the book. So the sealed scroll, that's in chapter 5, as I've already said. And then we read how the 6 seals are broken from the next chapter. And then eventually we come to the 7th seal. When that's broken, we read about the trumpets, 7 trumpets. Eventually, the 7th trumpet is sounded at the end of chapter 11. And then eventually we come to the 7 scales. The veils containing God's wrath. So this is sort of the general overview of the structure of the book.
Maybe, Lebay, I can start with an interesting event. This morning in our service in the church, we focused on the Lamb, Revelation chapter 5, and Christ, the Lamb of God, standing in the middle of the throne, the only one worthy to open the 7 seals. And it is interesting that he had to open them one by one. the Bible reads, when he opened the first seal, and a certain event took place. So these seals or prophetic words are not merely like a written code. It is actually like a, like a written drama taking place, or an action revealed. So there are angels and many things happening after each seal is opened, and John is the witness, explaining, or just telling us what he saw. But the amazing thing is that it seems to be very ordered, these future events, because there are the 7 seals, and then the 7th seal is also it is containing the 7 trumpets.
Yes.
It is contained in the 7th seal, and then the 7 trumpets in the 7th one, the 7 scales or 7 bowls are contained. So it seems to be following very logic, and the total of that is the whole of the end time prophecy, and as Willie mentioned, with certain events which is highlighted. So it really looks like God has got his plans fixed, and it is organized, and it is rolling it out in a very clear plan.
Yes. So, Carl, in your mind, if you look at this, I know previously we discussed that it might be, I want to say 3 incidents that it represents the same thing but in different ways, or the possibility that it's, if you look at that linear progression, it's the 7 seals, and then it moves on to the 7 trumpets, and then it moves on to the 7 scales. What's your view on that?
Yeah, there are definitely different theories interpreting these events. Some people interpret it as these 7 seals explained, and then when you move to the 7 trumpets, for instance, they say it is actually the same events view, just from a different perspective, and then also the 7 scales are also the same events, like a cyclic explanation, as you've said. But I do not believe that that's the correct interpretation, because especially when you come at the end, there it is clearly said that these are the last of the plagues that God brought onto earth. And there are also a very clear progression in intensity of the plagues. The first I think it is, the first trumpets are a third of nature is, are involved in these plagues, and then a third of the sea, a third of the water resources, a third of the sun is affected, or the sunlight reaching earth. But then when you come to the scales, it's not just a third, it's the whole earth being affected in a more severe manner. But the same areas mentioned, the water, the sea, the sun, and the people. So to me, it seems quite clear that we have a progression. It is not just the same events from different perspectives, but it is actually different events growing in intensity as the end comes closer.
Yeah. And then
I think what is also important is just to remember the book was sealed with 7 seals. So all the prophecies are contained within the 7 seals. One can't see the trumpets and the bells apart as something different. They are all contained in the 7 seals, because the whole book was sealed with the 7 seals.
Yes,
So
that's
in
a very
that
good point.
sense, the 7 seals contains all the prophecies.
Yeah.
But in another sense, there are aspects, for example, under the first seals, the first 6 seals, which I think is in a certain sense a kind of summary of everything that's going to happen. So there's definitely an element of that. But in another sense, especially when one starts with the first trumpet, there's definitely that we can see a progress in intensification in the kind of wrath that is cast upon the earth. So there's definitely, in my view, intensification, and I think the author also refers to it in that way, that in the end it's much worse. Clearly, it's the range of and the effects of the plagues is much larger, and the whole earth is in a certain sense and in many different ways also involved in this whole process. And there's also a question about the meaning of the plagues. Is it God that is sort of casting the plagues on earth, or is it such that in a certain sense that the things that's happening on earth is kind of an indirect wrath of God? For example, war, I think we'll talk about it in more detail later on, but in many respects, some of these depictions seems to be quite vivid expressions of war. So in that sense, perhaps one also have indirect expressions of God's wrath. For example, with Nebuchadnezzar, when he attacked Jerusalem, it was part of God's wrath, but it was indirect wrath. It was not in the sense that he has, cast upon the earth his direct wrath and hit the earth in some way with things that earthquakes or whatsoever, but he used Nebuchadnezzar. So I think in the end of times and in the context of what we're talking about, definitely I believe that this is also true in this case. It's not necessarily only God's direct wrath, although I do think when we come to the end, that we do see in the descriptions and so on, especially in chapter 16, the vowels seems to be an expression of God's direct wrath.
Yeah, very interesting.
There's also an interesting order that I've seen in the 3 series of events. All of them, although it is every time 7, the number 7, which is an important number in the book of Revelation, the number of perfection. Every time it seems to be 4 plus 2 plus 1. For instance, if you look at the 7 seals, it is the 4 heavenly creatures. Each time they give the lamp, open the seal, they give the command, and then the horse rider moves out. But it is just 4 horse riders that moves out. And then after that, there are 2 other events. The souls at the throne, under the throne of God, and the 6th one is a big earthquake and very big signs on the cosmic elements.
Maybe you can move the view, then the viewers can also see what Carl is referring to. Oh, there we are.
Yeah, there you can see it. You see the first 4 are quite the same. It's the 4 horses, and before the horses move out, it is the cherubim, or those big creatures that, like thunder, give the command. And then the last 2 are a little bit different. It's the martyrs and God's anger in the cosmic signs. And when you move,
and also the great earthquake that's mentioned there, and even the whole expand the whole cosmos, as you've mentioned. Yeah.
Yes, and every time you get that same order, it is 4, and then 2, and then another one. And the last one every time is linked to the 7 new or the next plagues coming. So this order is very strict, keeping it and laying it open every time. So it's very interesting to see how strongly the book is ordered.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
maybe you can also move just to the trumpets also, and we can have a look at that. Yeah, so Carl, that's what you've mentioned, the 1/3 that's been touched by these plagues.
The first
Every
4, yeah.
time it's, yeah, 1/3 that's been touched, from the trees, and the ocean, water sources, the sun and moon, harmful mankind, and these many different descriptions of these strange creatures that is mentioned here. Horses with some elements of scorpions and so forth. It's quite a vivid description. But at this stage, we're only focusing on the overall structure. So here we can clearly see how nicely that it's 6 trumpets. It's definitely a kind of chronological order here, but the 3rd is the one thing that's shared by all of them. Yeah.
Just for my curiosity, 1/3. Why do you guys think it's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3? Is there? Do you guys have any thoughts around that?
Well, to start, it is obviously in comparison to the last plagues, which are not merely partial, but complete. Which is not just 1/3, but which is 3 on 3. So yeah, I've seen that the progression. But 1/3 maybe, well, that's probably it's severe, but 2/3 are spared.
Yes.
Perfect. I think it's also a kind of warning, a first warning. That's why it's only 1/3 that's been touched of everything on earth. And if one sees these things as also involving and referring to war, some kind of, because in the seals that we've just seen, maybe if you can go one backwards on the slide, one can see the red horse. Actually, the 2nd seal refers to war. So war is definitely an important element. And the black horse, also hunger and all those things. Yeah, and the grey horse, death. So all these things are closely linked. And if you go back to the trumpets, so one can then in that case perhaps see this as a first warning from God's side, but from a human perspective, maybe it's a first phase in which we have terrible wars and events pertaining to all aspects of life on earth, but insofar as it's to be compared with the last one, it's only 1/3 that's been touched. If you go to the last, from the trumpets to the bells, then we read under this, when the 7th trumpet will blown, we read that there's many things that's mentioned under that side, sort of everything that still has to come. But especially mention is also made of the wrath of God that has come to fulfillment. And the best expression of that is definitely in these bells, the 7 bells. But in all these cases, we read that it's all the rivers, everything in the sea, the sun scorches, men with fire, darkness, demonic powers, this great, terrible battle that's been prepared, great hail, and also earthquakes, terrible earthquakes. So in this case, it's just that everything on earth it's touched. It's a kind of a near destruction of earth itself, perhaps even destruction of earth itself, in a way that we can't really imagine. at this stage.
It is also
Isn't-
interesting. Sorry, Willie, I was too busy.
No, it's me.
It seems, thanks, that the seven seals, it's like the door is opened for these destructive things to happen, and then it is intensifying. Like the if you can go back quickly, Levi, please, to the horses, the seals. Yeah, the wall piece is taken away. That is the red horse. The black horse is poverty, and the grey horse is death. So these are all consequences of the events we read in the other series of 7, and the martyrs and God's wrath. So it is indeed, Billy, as you said, it is an intensifying. God is touching the earth, calling us to, calling the people to turn back to Him, because we all know when things get really hard, that is when you cry out to God. You know, when you are really in trouble and you experience hardship, it's not, the meaning of that is not just judgment, but it is to really stop you in your tracks and to make you think about your life and to call out to God to help you. And I do believe that many people will be saved in these things that will happen. We see it over and over in many places which were touched, for instance, by war. You read that people, when they are faced with death, they cry out to God. And I've heard of quite a few conversions from people who face death and who realize that this is the end of the road for them. So in that sense, you know, it is an very, very urgent call of heaven to turn back to God, because we all know that life on earth is just temporary. And when things get desperate here, it is God trying to shake us and shake the whole planet to wake up and understand that we must turn back to our Maker. And the call will just get harder and louder as time goes on.
Yeah, and we see a lot of these things happening around us, eh?
Indeed.
Yeah, which is really interesting.
So
Very,
on the one hand, we have this basic structure that we've just seen, the 7 seals that contains all the prophecy. The 7th seal that also includes the 7 trumpets, and the 7th trumpet that includes the 7 bells. But then that's a basic structure that one finds throughout the rest of the book of Revelation. But then during this process that the prophecy is being revealed to John, he had certain visions where he saw certain things. And maybe we can also just go through that, because that also tells a story. And it gives some more detail, and it gives a totally different angle. And again, we can go in chronological order as it's been mentioned throughout the book of Revelation. So in chapter 7, we read about those that were sealed for the trumpets, so that the trumpets do not hurt them in any way, 144,000. And then we also read about the martyrs. Those we read it's a great multitude of people, and it's those coming from the Great Tribulation. So that tells us that the Great Tribulation, it's a term that's been used here and also in the book of Matthew to refer to end time events, and many scholars do think that, or believe that, it refers to those final and most intense period, this final and most intense period before the end. So this is just a depiction of these martyrs in heaven. So if we go further, then we find that a little bit later. Focus is in chapters 11. We find it's a focus on Jerusalem that's been trampled by the nations for 24 months. And then also the two witnesses of God that appear. And then, but is this 24 months? Isn't it? It's
42.
8.5 years.
It
must
should be 42.
Should be 42.
I exhibited some dyslexia there, so I'll correct it
Yeah,
later.
I actually something similar happens to me quite often. I just couldn't. 24 is definitely not right.
I was hoping for it to go past very quickly. So
Yeah, I see. Okay, now so it's trampled for 42 months, and that's correct.
Eliminated.
Yeah, so for 42 months, and then also the two witnesses in Jerusalem witnessing against the beast, the one that came forth from the earth, and will be in somehow he will be also be ruling in Jerusalem, and they will resist his power, and they will die. He will kill them, but they will be resurrected after 3.5 days. So this is a very powerful expression of things that will happen, but especially Jerusalem being trampled by the nations for 42 months. Clearly, this is also something related to a great and a terrible war that will take place in line with what we've seen, this red horse representing peace that's been taken away from the earth, and war that will erupt. And with the war, all these terrible things that go with, especially on such a global scale, the famine, everything coming together with that, death, enormous amounts of people dying, not only in war. We see at the moment in the Ukraine, so many people dying in the war, but when it's on such a large scale, then it'll also happen that many people will just die because of famine and a pest and other kind of things that'll plague the rest of the world because of various reasons that is closely linked to this global situation where the world is at war. So if you go further, then we see that what is also that's in chapter 12, what we've just discussed is in chapter 11. In chapter 12, we read about the woman, and we'll discuss her in more detail, but she's in the desert, and the dragon tries to kill her child, and she flee into the desert. We also read about a beast that comes forth from the sea, a great and terrible beast, in many respects quite similar to the dragon. Then we read about another beast that came from the earth, and a kind of shamanistic figure, and we'll discuss all of that. And then eventually also in chapter 13, in the beginning, we read again of about 1,444 or 144,000 that is in heaven. It seems that they are in heaven. So these are also gives us just a sort of a small a picture of the main players in this final events, or in the events that's being described here. If one sees them in a final sense, then maybe it is end time events. Perhaps the beast will be the Antichrist, but we will discuss those things. And then another thing that's been focused on is in chapter 17, where we read that the Great War is burned, chapter 17. And chapter 18, we read that Babylon falls. It's actually a a song of lamentation for the fall of Babylon. And then we read how Jesus actually riding on a white horse in great power into war. Perhaps it's the great battle of Armageddon that's been depicted there in chapter 19. And in chapter 20, we read about 1,000 years and the devil that's bound. We will discuss those things. And then also in that chapter, we read about the great and final judgment that will take place. And then in the next chapter, we read about the new heaven and the new earth that will arrive. So this is just giving an overview and just focusing on these different visions that the prophet had during this period when everything was revealed to him, gives quite a sense of the kind of things that is important and things that we'll focus on during the course of these discussions.
It's actually terrible when you look at everything. You look at the flow and the intensifying, but then it's almost a relief, a new earth and a new Jerusalem. Okay, I think I'm just gonna. Did you want to look at some of the slides again, Willie, or can I?
No, you can proceed. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, Carl, anything to add to that?
Maybe I can just give a remark. It is quite interesting if you look at the Bible and compare it with the plagues in Exodus.
Yes.
That Moses trying to convince Pharaoh to let God's people go, and Pharaoh putting a lot of pressure on God's people, and the plagues coming over Egypt. There are quite a lot of comparison if you look at those plagues and that whole event. It seems to be somehow also a prophetic event pointing to the end times. So I find that very interesting, that in the beginning of the Bible once again and in the end of the Bible, you have the same lines and the same events, like in the sense that the first one is a type of, or an expression or a shadow of the end one. Yeah, maybe we can get some light from Exodus to understand Revelation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what is also interesting is, right in the beginning of the Bible, in Genesis, we read about paradise, Adam and Eve in paradise. And then right at the end, in the last chapter, we also read about paradise and the river of paradise and the trees of paradise. So there's a kind of cycle here.
Yes.
And since the time of the fall and eventually the final, where everything is restored and God rules in a final sense in the new Jerusalem and the new in the new cosmos. So it's quite interesting how all these things are actually integrated as part of a single story throughout the Bible. But to return to Revelation, so what we've seen previously in our discussion is that John, who sees these things, we believe that it's the apostle. That's what has been handed down to us from the early church fathers, that he had this vision. He was taken by the Spirit, and in heaven he saw the glory of God. He saw Jesus, the Lamb, as if being slaughtered, and in the right hand of God, this book with the 7 seals. And when the seals are broken, this is what happens from chapter 6 towards the end, chapter 12 to 22, this whole prophetic part and what it means. I think this is what is fascinating and has kept the church busy for about 2,000 years, and there are different views. We've discussed it, and we'll focus on all the different chapters as we move through it. But I think what we've done today is just give a sort of overview. It just shows which are the most important players in this story being told, especially the beast. He plays a very important role. We read that he comes forth from the earth, but we later on we read he came forth from the sea, and then we actually read that he came forth from Hades, from the abode of the dead,
The underworld.
And he is responsible for the death of many. We read that he actually many will die during this period, and then that's why we also read about the martyrs, the great tribulations, the expression used in chapter 7. So it's clearly terrible times we're talking about, a third of the earth being in some way touched by these things, later on the whole earth in all respects, And while God is actually pouring out these different plagues on earth, either direct or indirect things that's happening on earth, we do read that the people on earth did not want to
Repent.
to convert themselves. They didn't want to repent. They resisted this. They rejected God's view. And especially in Jerusalem, we read that's extremely difficult times with the beasts seemingly ruling there, because we have the two people testifying there, and they were killed by the beast and later resurrected. So terrible times. But what everything means, we'll be talking about it in more detail as we go chapter by chapter through it from the next discussion now.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful structure, but it also emphasizes how much we have to unpack over the next year. So fascinating, fascinating. Any final words, Carl?
Yeah, I would like to summarize it. If you look at the structure, there's a very clear intensification of the so-called bad news, the dark times that will come in the days ahead, and already some of it we experience. And we have to see it as a call of heaven to turn back to God, and a very urgent call. And even as I've mentioned, Egypt, also there was an intensification of plagues. But as the Lord kept his people in Egypt, he will also keep his people in the end times. And we are called to be faithful to him and, to be faithful witnesses, because even in the most difficult times of perseverance, the persecutors can, they can find the Lord if we testify and if we are faithful. So that is our calling, to remain faithful and just to point to God and to point people to God.
Yeah, absolutely. Entering that dialogue. Like a friend of mine said, point people to the voice of Jesus in their lives. Hopefully over the next few months, you guys can also tell me where the central bank digital currency fits in, but that's a different topic. Wonderful. But thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it. It's really fascinating. And I just, as I said previously, love the fact that we've got the structure in place now, so we can use that as a starting point. And again, for everybody listening to the podcast, I see there's quite a few people that have gone back and listened to some of the previous ones as well. Feel free to do that. If there's any questions, email us at info@biblegps.com, and there's a massive amount of worthwhile information on Vili's blog as well. But thanks again, guys, and hope you have a wonderful week.
Thank you, Levi. Blessings.
Thank you, Levi.